After 30 years studying cryptids across 6 continents, I can tell you with absolute certainty that encountering a dogman is far worse than facing a werewolf. The werewolf might tear you apart in a frenzy of lunar madness, but the dogman will hunt you with calculated precision, study your patterns, and choose the exact moment when you are most vulnerable. One operates on instinct and curse, the other on intelligence that borders on human. I have spent 3 decades documenting encounters with both creatures, interviewing survivors, examining evidence, and in some cases witnessing the aftermath myself. What I have learned has fundamentally changed how I understand the hierarchy of cryptid threats. The werewolf, for all its terrifying power, remains a predictable force tied to cycles and transformation. The dogman exists in a state of permanent evolution, always aware, always calculating. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. My background in cryptozoology began not in academia but in survival. I grew up in the forests of northern Michigan, where my grandfather told stories that the local historical society dismissed as folklore. He spoke of creatures that walked on 2 legs through the pine forests, that stood taller than any man, and that watched our family cabin from the tree line with eyes that reflected firelight like polished amber. When I was 19, I saw what my grandfather had described. It stood at the edge of our property for nearly 3 minutes, perfectly still, observing our evening routine through the kitchen window. That sighting led me to abandon my plans for medical school and pursue the documentation of creatures science refused to acknowledge. I have no regrets about that choice, though the knowledge I have gained carries a weight that grows heavier each year. The fundamental difference between werewolves and dogmen lies in their origin and nature. Werewolves, according to every documented case and historical account I have studied, are humans transformed by curse, infection, or supernatural affliction. The transformation is involuntary, temporary, and tied to lunar cycles in most traditions. The human consciousness is either suppressed or twisted during the change, leaving the werewolf operating primarily on predatory instinct. The dogman, by contrast, appears to be a distinct species that has existed alongside humanity for thousands of years. There is no transformation, no curse to break, no human consciousness buried beneath the animal rage. What you see is what the dogman has always been, a bipedal canid predator with cognitive abilities that may exceed our own in certain areas. This permanence makes every encounter exponentially more dangerous. I first encountered a werewolf in Romania in 1997 while investigating reports of livestock killings in a village near the Carpathian Mountains. The local priest had contacted me after 3 sheep were found dead in a manner inconsistent with wolf or bear attacks. The wounds were too precise, too surgical, and the remaining sheep showed signs of extreme terror days after the incidents. I set up observation posts around the pastures during the full moon period, working with 2 local hunters who knew the terrain. On the 3rd night, we heard the screaming. It came from the direction of an isolated barn where a farmer had left his remaining flock for protection. The sound was not animal, not entirely, but it carried a quality of anguish that human vocal cords should not be able to produce. When we reached the barn, we found the door torn from its hinges and thrown 15 feet into the yard. Inside, the scene was one of chaos rather than calculation. The sheep had been killed quickly, their deaths efficient but lacking any pattern. The werewolf had fed briefly and then moved on, following its instinctive drive rather than any plan. We tracked it to the forest edge where the prints showed 5 toes and claws, the spacing suggesting a creature moving on 2 legs but dropping to 4 when speed was needed. The transformation back to human form happened before dawn, and we found the individual collapsed in a ravine 3 miles from the barn. He had no memory of the night, no awareness of what his body had done. His hands were covered in blood, and his clothes were shredded, but his eyes showed only confusion and growing horror as we explained what we had documented. The werewolf operates without consent, a prisoner in its own transformed flesh. My first dogman encounter happened 2 years later in northern Wisconsin, and the difference was immediately apparent. A hunting party had reported something following them through state forest land, something that moved parallel to their position for over 6 miles without ever showing itself completely. They described glimpses through the trees, a figure that stood upright like a man, but moved with a fluidity no human could match. I interviewed each hunter separately, and their accounts aligned with disturbing precision. The Dogman had maintained a consistent distance of approximately 100 yards, adjusting its position whenever the hunters changed direction. It made no sound, left minimal tracks, and seemed to be studying them rather than stalking for a kill. When they finally retreated to their vehicles, they found fresh scratches on the doors, parallel marks that suggested the Dogman had visited their parking area while they were in the forest. The intelligence demonstrated in that encounter exceeded anything in werewolf behavior. The Dogman had assessed the threat level, maintained tactical positioning, and sent a clear message by marking their vehicles. This was not instinct or transformation-induced rage. This was a thinking predator making strategic decisions based on observation and analysis. Folklore about werewolves spans centuries and continents, from the loup-garou of French tradition to the Germanic werewolf legends. In nearly every cultural tradition, the werewolf is portrayed as a cursed human, someone who becomes a monster against their will. The transformation is often linked to sin, punishment, or supernatural contamination. European witch trials frequently included accusations of lycanthropy, and the prescribed remedies ranged from silver bullets to religious exorcism. The consistency across these legends suggests a common root in actual encounters, but the details reveal the limitations of werewolf threat. The transformation is temporary, the werewolf is vulnerable during daylight hours, and the human consciousness can sometimes be restored through intervention. The curse can be broken, the afflicted person can be saved. This gives werewolf encounters a tragic dimension, but also a finite quality. Dogman legends follow different patterns and appear in indigenous American traditions that predate European contact. The Ojibwe speak of the Wendigo, though that creature operates under different rules. More relevant are the stories from Great Lakes tribes about guardians of the forest, beings that walked like men but possessed the features and instincts of wolves. These were not cursed humans but a separate people, ancient and territorial. French fur trappers in the 1700s documented encounters with what they called the loup-garou, but their descriptions differed from European werewolf accounts. These creatures did not transform with the moon. They were consistently bipedal, consistently aware, and consistently hostile to human encroachment. Modern researchers have re-examined these historical accounts and found patterns suggesting ongoing Dogman populations in regions of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario. I spent 6 months in 2003 investigating a series of encounters in the Ottawa National Forest that demonstrated the strategic capacity of Dogman behavior. A logging crew had reported equipment tampering during their overnight shifts. Tools moved from their storage locations and arranged in patterns that suggested both intelligence and warning. The crew initially suspected vandalism from environmental activists. Security cameras captured something far more disturbing. The footage showed a Dogman approaching the equipment yard at 2 a.m., moving with deliberate caution and keeping to shadows wherever possible. It examined each piece of machinery, touching various controls and levers as if testing their function. Then it systematically moved tools from one area to another, creating a barrier pattern across the main access road. The implications were staggering. This Dogman understood the purpose of the equipment, recognized the access points for the logging operation, and took action to impede that operation without directly confronting the human workers. It demonstrated planning, problem-solving, and restraint. A werewolf would have destroyed the equipment in a rage. The Dogman sent a message and left the crew to interpret it. The physical differences between the creatures are significant, but not as defining as the behavioral distinctions. Werewolves in their transformed state typically stand 6 to 7 feet tall, heavily muscled and covered in coarse fur. The head is lupine, but the skull structure often retains human proportions, creating an unsettling hybrid appearance. The transformation is incomplete, leaving visible evidence of the human form beneath. Dogmen stand taller, often reaching 7 to 9 feet when fully upright. The body structure is more proportional to the increased height, with longer limbs and a torso that tapers toward the waist, like a canid, rather than maintaining human dimensions. The head is fully canine, usually resembling a large wolf or German shepherd, with no human features present. The eyes are forward-facing like a predator, providing binocular vision and depth perception that aids in hunting. The hands present perhaps the most crucial difference. Werewolf hands retain a partially human structure with opposable thumbs, making them capable of grasping but clumsy in manipulation. Dogman hands are more developed, with longer fingers and fully opposable thumbs that allow for tool use and fine motor control. I have documented cases where dogmen have opened latches, turned doorknobs, and manipulated complex mechanisms. One encounter from northern Minnesota in 2008 illustrated this capability in disturbing fashion. A family had secured their cabin for the winter, using heavy-duty locks and reinforced doors after previous break-ins by bears. When they returned in spring, they found the cabin had been entered through a second-story window. The window latch had been manipulated from the outside, something requiring both reach and dexterity. Inside, the cabin showed signs of occupation, but not vandalism. Food stores had been consumed selectively, items moved but not destroyed, and a sleeping area created in the loft using blankets from a storage chest. The family found tracks in the dust that clearly showed dogman prints, five-toed with claw marks, but the spacing indicated bipedal movement throughout the cabin. The creature had lived there for weeks, using human shelter and resources with evident understanding. This crosses a threshold that werewolves never approach. The werewolf remains fundamentally animal in its transformed state, driven by hunger and aggression, without the capacity for long-term planning or environmental adaptation. The dogman demonstrates cultural behavior, using tools and shelter in ways that suggest learned knowledge passed between individuals or generations. The hunting strategies differ in ways that reveal the cognitive gap. Werewolves hunt in a pattern consistent with large predators, using strength and speed to overwhelm prey. They rely on the element of surprise and their physical advantages. The hunt is direct, violent, and relatively short in duration. Once the transformation ends, the werewolf has no memory of the hunt and no ability to learn from the experience. Dogmen employ tactics that would be familiar to any military strategist. They scout their targets over extended periods, learning routines and identifying vulnerabilities. They use terrain to their advantage, setting up ambush points along known travel routes. They demonstrate patience that can extend for days or weeks, waiting for the optimal moment to act. And crucially, they remember previous encounters and modify their approach based on what worked or failed. I documented a case in 2011 that exemplified this methodical approach. A conservation officer in Upper Michigan had been investigating deer poaching in a remote section of state forest. He set up trail cameras along known deer paths, hoping to identify the individuals responsible. Instead, he captured footage of a dogman engaging in what can only be described as counter-surveillance. The dogman appeared on camera 4 times over 2 weeks. In each instance, it approached the camera directly, examined it from multiple angles, and then either adjusted the camera position or covered the lens with vegetation. The footage showed the creature using sticks to manipulate the cameras without touching them directly, suggesting an understanding of scent tracking and evidence. By the 3rd week, the officer found all 6 of his cameras relocated to face away from the deer paths. This represents a level of awareness that should terrify anyone working in dogman territory. The creature not only recognized the cameras as monitoring devices but understood their function well enough to neutralize them. It demonstrated knowledge of human investigation methods and took active measures to evade documentation. A werewolf would have ignored or destroyed the cameras without comprehension. The territorial behavior of dogmen adds another layer of danger. Unlike werewolves, which wander during their transformed state following prey and instinct, dogmen maintain defined territories that they defend with increasing aggression. These territories can span dozens of square miles and are marked using methods that parallel wolfpack behavior. Scent marking, scratch marks on trees, and strategic placement of prey remains as warnings. What makes this territorial behavior particularly dangerous is the dogman's apparent ability to recognize individual humans. I have interviewed multiple witnesses who reported being allowed to pass through dogman territory once but confronted on subsequent visits. The creatures appear to track human individuals, remember their scent or appearance, and respond differently based on perceived threat levels. A forestry researcher in Ontario experienced this escalation pattern in 2014. Her first encounter involved glimpsing a dogman at a distance while conducting a tree survey. The creature observed her for several minutes and then withdrew without approaching. She returned to the same area 2 weeks later and found the trees she had marked now bore fresh scratch marks directly over her survey tags. Her third visit brought direct confrontation. The dogman blocked her path on the trail, standing fully upright and making a low vocalization that she described as combining a growl with an almost mechanical clicking sound. It made no move to attack, but maintained its position until she retreated. The message was unmistakable. The creature had permitted her first intrusion, warned her after the second, and now demanded she leave permanently. This graduated response demonstrates reasoning ability and social communication far beyond werewolf capacity. The dogman was setting boundaries, enforcing them through escalating intimidation, and apparently hoping to resolve the territorial dispute without violence. A werewolf operates on simpler programming: defend territory through immediate attack, or flee if outmatched. The dogman's approach suggests it understands consequences and prefers outcomes that don't risk injury. The vocalization patterns of both creatures provide another point of comparison. Werewolf vocalizations during transformation are typically screams or howls that express pain and rage. In the transformed state, they produce sounds consistent with large canids, growls, snarls, and howls used for simple communication of aggression or territorial claims. The sounds are emotionally driven and reactive rather than purposeful. Dogman vocalizations are more complex and appear to serve communicative functions beyond simple threat display. Witnesses have reported hearing what sound like structured calls, variations in pitch and rhythm that suggest information exchange. Some researchers have documented what appear to be mimicry attempts, dogmen reproducing human speech patterns or mechanical sounds in ways that suggest experimental learning. One of the most disturbing accounts I investigated came from a hunting camp in northern Wisconsin in 2016. The group heard what they initially thought was another hunter calling for help in the distance. The voice shouted words that were almost intelligible but distorted, as if someone was speaking through a damaged throat. They followed the sound for nearly a mile before realizing the voice was leading them away from their camp. When they returned, they found a dogman had entered their camp during their absence. It had opened their food storage, consumed specific high-protein items, and left claw marks on the tent canvas in a pattern that resembled tally marks. The hunters described feeling psychologically violated, not just by the theft, but by the evident planning and manipulation involved. The dogman had used a lure tactic to create an opportunity. The question of dogman's social structure adds another dimension to the threat assessment. Werewolves operate as solitary entities during transformation, each cursed individual hunting alone unless the pack structure comes from human social bonds that persist through transformation. Evidence for werewolf packs is minimal in historical accounts and modern encounters. Dogmen, by contrast, show clear evidence of social organization. Multiple witnesses have reported seeing 2 or more dogmen together, and the behavioral patterns suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Footprint evidence occasionally shows groups traveling together with different size prints, indicating possible family units or age-based hierarchies. I investigated a case in 2017 that suggested coordinated pack hunting. A rural property in Michigan experienced a series of livestock losses over 3 weeks. Security footage captured 3 dogmen approaching the property from different directions, moving in apparent coordination, while 2 created a disturbance near the barn, drawing out the farm dogs. The third entered the chicken coop from the opposite side. The tactics were sophisticated, using distraction and division of attention to achieve their goal. The 3 dogmen left together with 1 carrying the chickens. They moved in formation, the largest in front and the others following at regular intervals. This wasn't random convergence of individuals, but coordinated group action with defined roles. Pack behavior magnifies every threat factor I have discussed. If dogmen operate in social units, they share information, teach successful strategies, and potentially coordinate on scales that could threaten entire communities. A single dogman using intelligence and planning is dangerous enough. A pack of them working together represents a threat on par with any known predator. The physiological advantages of dogmen extend beyond their size and strength. Their sensory capabilities appear to exceed both human and wolf standards. Witnesses consistently report that dogmen seem aware of human presence from remarkable distances, suggesting highly developed olfactory and auditory senses. They move through forests at night with confidence that indicates either exceptional vision or some form of sensory perception we don't fully understand. One researcher in 2018 attempted to track a dogman through a Michigan state forest using traditional methods, following footprints and disturbed vegetation. He found that the dogman was simultaneously tracking him. The paths converged in a clearing where the researcher found his own backpack, which he had left at his vehicle 5 miles away. The dogman had circled behind him, located his vehicle, retrieved the backpack, and placed it where he would find it. The message was clear. The dogman knew where the researcher had come from, where his escape route lay, and could access it whenever it chose. The researcher was not the hunter in this scenario, but the observed. This inversion of the traditional predator-prey relationship creates a psychological dimension to dogman encounters that werewolf encounters lack. Fear of werewolves is primal but finite. You fear the transformation, the loss of control, the violent death. These are immediate, comprehensible threats. Fear of dogmen includes those elements but adds the terror of being studied, manipulated, and potentially hunted by something that understands you better than you understand it. The question of dogman intelligence has led some researchers, myself included, to uncomfortable conclusions. If these creatures possess cognitive abilities comparable to human intelligence, what does that mean for how we classify them? Are they animals? Or are they a rival sapient species that has simply chosen to avoid open contact with humanity? The evidence leans increasingly toward the latter interpretation. I spent considerable time examining historical accounts that might reference dogmen under different names. French-Canadian trappers in the 1600s wrote of creatures they called the rougarou, describing them as wolf-headed men who walked upright and stole from trap lines with obvious intelligence. Unlike werewolf legends, these accounts emphasize the creature's permanent nature and their apparent understanding of trapping technology. The trappers reported that the rougarou would disable traps without triggering them, suggesting they understood the mechanism of spring-loaded devices. They would take bait without getting caught, leave mock tracks to mislead followers, and apparently communicate warnings to other trappers by leaving marked trees. These behaviors align perfectly with modern dogman encounters and suggest a continuous population adapting to human presence over centuries. Native American legends from the Great Lakes region describe similar beings under various names. The Ojibwe speak of creatures that are neither wolf nor man, but something separate, beings that possess their own language and social structure. These stories emphasize respect and avoidance rather than conflict, suggesting that indigenous peoples developed successful coexistence strategies through understanding dogman territorial needs. One Potawatomi elder I interviewed in 2009 described boundaries that his ancestors had maintained for generations, specific ridgelines and river crossings that were understood to mark the edge of dogman territory. His tribe had avoided those areas for hunting or travel, and in return, the dogmen had not interfered with tribal lands. This arrangement persisted until European settlement disrupted the traditional boundaries. Tool use has been documented in multiple encounters. Dogmen have been observed using sticks to probe or manipulate objects, using rocks to break open containers, and even using branches to obscure their tracks or create barriers. This goes beyond the simple tool use seen in some primates and represents problem-solving behavior that indicates abstract thinking. A particularly striking example came from a wilderness guide in 2015 who found a dogman had constructed what appeared to be a blind, a shelter of branches and leaves positioned to overlook a game trail. The construction showed planning and understanding of concealment principles. The branches were woven together in a pattern that required fine motor skills and spatial reasoning. This wasn't random debris, but deliberate architecture. The guide photographed the structure before dismantling it and found that the dogman had reinforced key joints with stripped bark twisted into cordage. The creature had effectively created primitive rope to strengthen its construction. This represents not just tool use, but tool creation, a cognitive threshold that very few species achieve. The implications are staggering if we accept them fully. A case from 2019 in northern Ontario provided perhaps the strongest evidence of advanced cognition. A remote research station studying climate change had been experiencing systematic equipment failures. Motion-activated cameras caught a dogman examining their weather station instruments over multiple nights. On the fourth night, the dogman used a rock to break the lock on the equipment housing and removed the battery pack, effectively disabling the entire monitoring system. This required the creature to understand causation, to recognize that removing the battery would stop the equipment, and to identify which component powered the system. The level of technical comprehension implied is staggering. Werewolves might accidentally damage equipment in a rage, but they couldn't systematically disable it through targeted component removal. The moral implications of Dogman intelligence trouble me deeply. If these creatures think and reason at near-human levels, our encounters with them take on a different character. We are not dealing with dangerous animals, but with cognitive beings who may have their own cultures, societies, and potentially rights. Every aggressive encounter might be justified defense of territory from their perspective. I spoke with an indigenous elder in 2020 who offered a perspective that Western science struggles to accommodate. He described dogmen not as animals or monsters, but as the old people, beings who inhabited these forests long before human tribes arrived. According to his tradition, agreements were made in ancient times. The dogmen would remain in the deep forests and humans would not encroach beyond certain boundaries. The increasing frequency of dogman encounters, he suggested, results from human violation of these old agreements. We push roads deeper into wilderness, build cabins in remote areas, and treat the forests as resources to exploit, rather than territories to respect. From the dogman perspective, they are not attacking but defending their homes from invasion. This framing changes everything. Werewolf encounters are tragedies, a cursed individual causing harm they cannot control. Dogman encounters might be conflicts between two intelligent species competing for the same resources. The violence isn't senseless animal rage, but calculated territorial defense by a species protecting its habitat and way of life. The survival rates from encounters support this interpretation. Werewolf attacks, when they occur, are typically fatal or cause severe injury. The creature attacks with full force, driven by transformation-induced bloodlust. Survivors describe frenzied assaults that end only when the werewolf is driven off or sates its hunger. Dogman encounters, despite the creature's superior intelligence and planning ability, more frequently end with the human surviving. The dogman might approach, might intimidate, might even make physical contact through a shove or swipe, but often chooses not to kill when it clearly could. This suggests restraint, decision-making about when lethal force is necessary versus when intimidation achieves the goal. I analyzed over 200 documented dogman encounters and found that fewer than 15% involved serious physical injury. The majority ended with the human fleeing after a warning display or brief pursuit. Compare this to werewolf encounters where injury rates exceed 60% and fatality rates approach 40%. The dogman's choice not to kill is perhaps more frightening than if it attacked without thought, because that choice means it evaluated you as a threat, considered its options, and decided how to respond. It weighed the consequences of killing you against the benefit of letting you live to carry a warning. You survived not through luck or defense, but because the dogman permitted it. That knowledge stays with survivors in ways that simple escape from a mindless predator does not. The psychological trauma from dogman encounters reflects this deeper violation. Survivors of werewolf attacks suffer from PTSD related to the violence and injury, treatable through conventional therapy that addresses the traumatic event. Survivors of dogman encounters report a different quality of trauma, a persistent sense of being watched, an inability to feel safe in wilderness areas, and recurring intrusive thoughts about the creature's intentions. Several witnesses I interviewed described feeling marked, as if the dogman would remember them and find them again if they returned to the area. This isn't paranoia, but a rational response to demonstrated dogman behavior. These creatures do remember individual humans, do track them across time, and do modify their responses based on previous encounters. One particularly disturbing case from 2021 involved a wildlife photographer who encountered a dogman in northern Minnesota. The initial encounter was brief. The dogman observed her from a distance and withdrew when she noticed it. She returned to the area 6 months later and found her camera tripod, which she had left behind during the first encounter, placed prominently in the middle of the trail. The dogman had kept it for half a year and returned it when she came back. The tripod bore scratches that could have been decorative marks or could have been a form of communication. The photographer described feeling like she had received a gift, a gesture that confused the predator-prey framework she had brought to the encounter. Was this territorial marking? A warning? An attempt at communication? The ambiguity is itself disturbing because it suggests complexity we cannot decode. I have collected reports from 17 different witnesses who described similar object manipulation by Dogman. In each case, the creature took something belonging to the human, a tool, a piece of clothing, camping equipment, and either returned it later with modifications or left it in a location designed to send a message. This behavior has no parallel in werewolf encounters and suggests the dogman attributes significance to objects as representations of the humans who own them. The psychological dimension of this behavior cannot be overstated. When a dogman takes your belongings and returns them altered, it demonstrates several disturbing capabilities. First, it recognizes that objects belong to specific individuals. Second, it understands that manipulating those objects will be noticed and interpreted. Third, it remembers you well enough to return items when you revisit the area. Fourth, it chooses to interact with you through these objects rather than direct confrontation. This level of symbolic thinking and communication through objects is uniquely associated with higher intelligence. Even great apes, our closest relatives, rarely demonstrate this capacity outside of trained laboratory environments. The fact that dogmen engage in it spontaneously in the wild suggests their cognitive abilities may equal or exceed those of other great apes, positioning them uncomfortably close to human intelligence levels. The environmental awareness dogmen display further separates them from werewolves. Multiple witnesses have reported that dogmen seem to understand human technology and avoid it strategically. They stay clear of motion sensors, seem aware of camera placements, and demonstrate knowledge of effective ranges for different weapons. This isn't instinct but learned information that suggests observation of human behavior and possibly information sharing between individuals. A hunting party in Wisconsin in 2020 experienced this awareness firsthand. They had set up an elaborate network of trail cameras around their deer blind, hoping to monitor both wildlife and potential dogman activity. Over 3 nights, each camera was systematically disabled, not destroyed but simply turned to face a tree or covered with leaves. The sequence of disabling moved from the outermost cameras inward, suggesting the dogman understood the monitoring network and methodically neutralized it from the perimeter. What made this case extraordinary was that the final camera, the one closest to the deer blind, captured footage of the dogman approaching it. The creature moved with obvious caution, checking its surroundings repeatedly before reaching the camera. It examined the device from multiple angles, appearing to study how it was mounted and where the lens pointed. Then it used a branch to hook the camera strap and rotate the entire device to face away from the blind. The dogman never touched the camera directly, understanding that doing so would leave scent evidence. Folklore about defeating or escaping werewolves is extensive and relatively consistent. Silver weapons feature prominently across cultural traditions. Religious symbols and holy water appear in Christian-influenced accounts. Breaking the curse through various means, killing the werewolf during transformation, destroying the one who spread the curse, provides narrative resolution. The werewolf can be stopped, killed, or cured. Dogman folklore offers no such solutions. The indigenous traditions I have studied emphasize avoidance and respect rather than confrontation. There are no blessed bullets, no silver daggers, no curses to break. The dogman simply exists, has always existed, and will continue to exist regardless of human actions. The only safe response is to recognize their territory and stay out. Western attempts to hunt or study dogmen have consistently failed. The creatures evade trail cameras with disturbing frequency, avoid traps set by experienced hunters, and seem to vanish when tracking parties get close. The few pieces of physical evidence collected, hair samples, track casts, scat, have produced DNA results that confound analysis. The genetic material shows canid markers, but with sequences that don't match any known species. This leads to two possible conclusions. Either dogmen represent an undiscovered species that has successfully avoided scientific classification despite existing in relatively populated regions, or they are something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into our taxonomic frameworks. Both possibilities are unsettling for different reasons. The implications for human safety and land use are profound. If dogmen exist, as I and dozens of other researchers believe, we share significant portions of North American wilderness with a species that is intelligent, territorial, and potentially hostile to human encroachment. Current land management practices, recreation policies, and development projects proceed with no awareness of this reality. I have submitted reports to forestry services, wildlife management agencies, and law enforcement documenting dogmen encounters and evidence. The response has been consistent dismissal, categorizing the reports as misidentified bears, hoaxes, or psychological phenomena. The institutional resistance to acknowledging dogmen existence means no protective measures are implemented, no warning systems established, no research funded. This leaves individuals who venture into dogmen territory unwarned and unprepared. They don't know to watch for territorial markers, don't recognize warning behaviors, and don't understand that certain areas should be avoided entirely. The increasing frequency of encounters suggests dogman populations may be under pressure from habitat loss, potentially making them more aggressive in defending remaining territory. My final encounter, the one that convinced me to end field research, occurred in 2022 in the forests of Upper Michigan. I was investigating reports of unusual activity near a popular hiking trail, equipment disappearing, strange vocalizations at night, and several hikers reporting being followed by something they couldn't quite see. I set up an observation post overlooking the trail and waited through 3 nights without incident. On the 4th night, I heard movement in the forest behind my position, not on the trail but coming from deeper in the woods. I turned with my flashlight and saw a dogman standing 15 feet away, partially concealed behind a large pine tree. It stood completely still, watching me with an intensity that made my hands shake. The eyes reflected my flashlight with that amber glow I had first seen as a teenager at my grandfather's cabin. We regarded each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Then the dogman stepped fully out from behind the tree. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with dark fur that showed gray around the muzzle suggesting age. The body structure was perfectly balanced between human and canine, upright posture but clearly non-human proportions. The hands were the most disturbing feature, fully formed with long fingers and those opposable thumbs, holding a large branch like a staff. The dogman made no aggressive movement. It simply stood there, allowing me to see it clearly, as if it wanted me to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Then it vocalized, a sound that started as a low growl and shifted into something that resembled speech, syllables that my brain tried to parse as words but couldn't quite resolve. I realized in that moment that it was trying to communicate, not threaten. The dogman had approached deliberately, had shown itself fully, and was attempting some form of dialogue. This was not animal behavior. This was a thinking being making a conscious choice to interact with me on terms as close to equal as the situation allowed. I lowered my flashlight and spoke aloud, telling the dogman I meant no harm and was only observing. I felt absurd speaking to what science would call an animal, but my instinct insisted this was the appropriate response. The dogman tilted his head, a gesture so human-like it sent chills down my spine, and then turned and walked into the forest. Not running, not fleeing, but walking with purpose and dignity. I packed my equipment and left immediately. I have not returned to active field research since that night. The encounter fundamentally changed my understanding of what dogmen are and what our relationship with them should be. These are not animals to be studied or threats to be eliminated. They are intelligent beings with their own societies, their own territories, and their own right to exist. The question of why dogman encounters are worse than werewolf encounters has a complex answer. On the surface level, dogmen are more dangerous because they are smarter, more patient, and more capable of planning and executing sophisticated attacks. They remember you, track you, and can coordinate with others of their kind. But the deeper answer is that dogman encounters force us to confront the possibility that we are not alone as the dominant intelligent species on this planet. Werewolves are tragic, cursed humans losing themselves to animal nature. Dogmen are something separate, something that chose a different evolutionary path, something that watches us from the forest and makes decisions about us. When you encounter a werewolf, you face a monster. When you encounter a dogman, you face a mirror, another thinking being that developed in parallel with humanity but chose wilderness over civilization. The horror isn't in the claws or teeth, but in the recognition that we share this world with minds that may be as complex as our own. The survival strategy for werewolf encounters is relatively straightforward. Avoid the transformed individual during full moon periods. Use silver weapons if forced to fight. Seek to break the curse through whatever means your cultural tradition suggests. The werewolf is a problem with potential solutions. There is no survival strategy for dogman encounters because they are not a problem to solve. They are a reality to accept and accommodate. If you enter dogman territory, you do so as a guest at best and an intruder at worst. Your safety depends entirely on the dogman's choice to tolerate your presence. The only reliable approach is avoidance. Learn to recognize dogman territorial markers, unusual scratch patterns on trees, particularly on pine bark at heights above 7 feet. Listen for their vocalizations, especially the complex calls that seem to carry meaning beyond simple threat. Watch for signs of recent activity, disturbed equipment, relocated objects, tracks that show deliberate placement rather than random wandering. If you do encounter a dogman, do not run. Running triggers chase instinct in many predators, and while dogmen are intelligent enough to resist instinct, you don't want to test that assumption. Instead, back away slowly while maintaining eye contact. Speak in a calm voice, acknowledging its presence. If possible, leave something behind as an offering, food from your pack, a tool, anything that demonstrates you recognize its territory. Most importantly, if a dogman allows you to leave, never return to that specific location. The creature demonstrated restraint once, but repeated violations of its territory will eventually exhaust its patience. The dogman that lets you walk away today might not offer the same courtesy on your second or third intrusion. I share this information not to spread fear, but to promote understanding and respect. Dogmen are not evil or malicious. They are territorial intelligent beings defending their homes from what they perceive as invasion. The increasing frequency of encounters results from human expansion into wilderness areas that have been dogman territory for thousands of years. We can reduce these encounters by acknowledging dogman existence and adjusting our behavior accordingly. Mark certain wilderness areas as restricted not for resource management, but for interspecies respect. Teach hikers and campers to recognize warning signs and retreat when they appear. Fund research that prioritizes peaceful observation over capture or confrontation. The alternative is escalating conflict as human development pushes deeper into remaining wilderness and dogman populations defend their shrinking territories with increasing aggression. We have the intelligence to avoid this outcome, but only if we accept that we share this planet with other thinking beings who have as much right to their homes as we do to ours. My 30 years of research have taught me that the cryptid world is far more complex than simple monsters and myths. Werewolves exist, transformed humans suffering under supernatural curse. But dogmen are something else entirely. A species that chose the forest over the village, that developed intelligence without technology, that maintained their society while humans built civilization. They watch us from the tree lines, they listen to our conversations, they make decisions about us based on criteria we don't fully understand, and they remember. Every encounter, every interaction, every invasion of their territory gets recorded in whatever form of cultural memory they maintain. This is why dogman encounters are worse than werewolf encounters, not because they are more violent or more deadly in the immediate sense, but because they challenge our fundamental assumptions about our place in the natural world. We are not the only minds in the wilderness. We are not the unchallenged masters of the forest. We are observed, evaluated, and sometimes judged by beings whose intelligence may rival our own. I have closed my practice and donated my research materials to archives where they will be preserved for future investigators. I have done what I can to document the truth and share the knowledge. The rest is up to those who come after, whether they choose to respect the boundaries or ignore the warnings. If you take anything from this account, remember this: the werewolf is a tragic figure, a human caught in supernatural curse. You can pity the werewolf even as you fear it. The Dogman is not cursed and not human. It is itself fully conscious, fully aware, and fully capable of deciding whether you live or die. When you walk in the deep forests and feel eyes watching from the darkness, when you hear calls that sound almost like words, when you find your equipment moved in the night, you are not dealing with mindless animals or movie monsters. You are in the presence of the old people, the ones who are here first and who intend to remain. Respect their territory, heed their warnings, and never ever assume that surviving one encounter guarantees you will survive the next. The Dogman remembers you, and unlike the werewolf who forgets each transformation, the Dogman is always learning, always adapting, always aware. That permanent state of intelligence, that constant awareness, that ability to plan and remember and coordinate, makes every Dogman encounter potentially fatal in ways that werewolf encounters cannot match. You can prepare for the werewolf by tracking the moon and loading silver bullets. You cannot prepare for the Dogman because you never know when it has decided your presence is no longer acceptable. This is the knowledge I offer after 3 decades of research. This is the warning I share with anyone who ventures into wilderness areas where Dogmen have been documented. Respect what you do not understand. Fear what can think and plan and remember, and acknowledge that the forest belongs to them first and to us only by their continued tolerance. For more stories and research into the cryptid world, consider subscribing.